Nah, they didn't see me walk in. That was the point. I stood near the back of the conference room, holding a paper cup of coffee I hadn't touched, watching my brother adjust his tie in the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked the way he always looked at moments like this, satisfied before anything had even happened. My sister-in-law was beside him, whispering something in his ear that made him smile. Around them, a dozen suits from Meridian Capital filled the room, laptops open, folders stacked, ready to close the biggest deal of their careers. No one looked at me twice. I was wearing a blazer I'd bought 3 years ago, plain navy, slightly too big in the shoulders. I'd left my hair down. I wasn't carrying anything, except that cup of coffee and a single folded document in my jacket pocket. My brother finally turned and scanned the room, checking who was there, who mattered, who he needed to charm. His eyes passed over me the way they always had, quickly, carelessly. Then they came back. He blinked. Once. Twice. Sarah. He said my name like it was a question he didn't want the answer to. What are you doing here? I took a sip of the coffee. It had gone cold. I'm a shareholder, I said. I'm here for the vote. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind his eyes shifted. My sister-in-law touched his arm. One of the Meridian men looked up from his laptop. My brother laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind he'd been using on me my whole life. The kind that said, "You don't understand how things work." Sarah. He lowered his voice and stepped toward me. This isn't the time. We talked about this. You don't have enough shares to matter here. I looked at him for a long moment. I know what you think I have, I said. He didn't understand what that meant. Not yet. I found a chair at the far end of the table and sat down. My brother watched me for 3 full seconds, then turned back to his colleagues and laughed again. Softer this time, the way adults laugh when a child says something that would be embarrassing to correct out loud. I had waited 6 years for this morning. I could wait another 40 minutes. My father built Callaway Systems from nothing. That's not a figure of speech. He started it in the garage of the house I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, when I was 4 years old. I have a memory, I don't know if it's real or something I built from photographs, of sitting on an overturned bucket near his workbench, watching him solder something small and complicated while the radio played. He smelled like coffee and machine oil. He always had a pencil behind his ear. By the time I was 12, Callaway Systems had 14 employees and a contract with a regional logistics company. By the time I was in high school, it had 60 employees, and my father had moved it into a proper building on the east side of the city. It wasn't a household name. It was never going to be. But it was real, and it was his, and it worked because he poured every hour of his adult life into making it work. My mother died when I was 9. After that, it was just the 3 of us. My father, my brother Marcus, and me. Marcus was 7 years older. By the time I started middle school, he was already out of the house, living with friends, drifting from one thing to the next. My father paid his rent twice, bailed him out of one bad business venture involving a food truck, never said a word about it to anyone. That was my father. He believed in people even when they gave him no reason to. Marcus met his wife Diane when I was 15. She was 10 years older than me and had very specific opinions about everything, including which members of the family deserved what. I didn't understand it then. I was a teenager. I thought her coldness toward me was just personality. Later I understood it was strategy. My father had a stroke the summer after my first year of college. He survived, but it changed him, slowed his speech, left a tremor in his right hand that never fully went away. He kept coming into the office, but Marcus started coming too, helping out, being present in a way he had never been before. My father was grateful. He said it more than once. Your brother has really stepped up, Sarah. It means a lot to me. I was at Ohio State on a partial scholarship, working 20 hours a week at a campus IT desk, taking out loans to cover the rest. I came home every holiday. I called twice a week. But I was not there in the daily, visible way that Marcus was. And I think my father, in his diminished state, registered presence more than he registered history. I'm not saying my father was fooled. I'm saying he was tired, and he loved his son, and he wanted to believe things were going to be okay. He updated his will 18 months before he died. I didn't know about the update until after the funeral. My father passed away in March 4 years ago. Heart failure, sudden in the night. He was 63 years old. I drove home from Columbus in the dark and sat in the driveway of my childhood home for 20 minutes before I could go inside. The weeks after were a blur. There was a funeral to arrange. There were relatives I hadn't seen in years. There was food appearing in the kitchen and cards on the counter and phone calls I couldn't return. Marcus handled the estate. He told me our father had left him controlling interest in Callaway Systems 60% of the shares. I would receive 15% of the shares. The remaining 25% was held by two longtime employees, a man named Gerald, who had been with my father since the beginning, and the younger woman named Patricia, who ran operations. I was 26 years old. I had never had a lawyer. I didn't know what questions to ask. What I did know was that my father had told me something. Once, during one of my visits in his last year, we were sitting in the backyard in the evening, and he was in a good mood, clear-headed, talking about the business the way he used to before the stroke. He said, "I want to make sure you're taken care of, Sarah. I'm building something that will matter to both of you. I haven't forgotten you." I held on to those words. I didn't know then that they were the most important thing he had ever said to me. Marcus ran the company for 2 years. He moved it out of Dayton, relocated it to Columbus, restructured the management team. Gerald retired early. Patricia was let go in the first round of layoffs. The employees who had known my father were replaced one by one with people Marcus had brought in himself. The company still turned a profit. Marcus made sure of that. But it was not my father's company anymore. It had my father's name on the building and nothing else. I worked in software development at a mid-sized company in Columbus. I was good at my job. I got promoted twice in 3 years. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment and paid down my student loans and saved as aggressively as I knew how. I did not touch the 15% stake in Callaway Systems. I did not sell it, even when Marcus suggested twice that he'd like to buy me out. Both times, I told him I'd think about it. I was already thinking about something else. The call came from a woman named Helen Park. She was a paralegal at an estate law firm in Dayton, and she had worked with my father's original attorney, a man who had since retired. She had found something while digitizing old client files. She wanted to know if I was the daughter of Robert Callaway. I told her I was. She sent me a document. It was a shareholder agreement my father had drafted 3 years before his death and had signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, including Helen herself. It had never been filed properly. A clerical error. His attorney had apparently intended to formalize it after a follow-up meeting that never happened because my father had his first stroke the following week. The document stated that in the event of his death, an additional 22% of shares in Callaway Systems were to be transferred to me, held in trust until I chose to exercise them. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 4 times. Then, I called a lawyer. It took 8 months to get the document validated and the shares recognized. Marcus hired 2 attorneys to challenge it. He said the document was informal, improperly filed, that my father hadn't understood what he was signing. His attorneys argued intent and process and standing. My attorney argued a document was valid, witnessed, and unambiguous. I won. Quietly, without any press, without any drama, a settlement agreement was filed. My additional shares were recognized. The transfer was processed. I now held 37% of Callaway Systems. Marcus had no idea what I had done next, because the moment the shares cleared, I began making calls. Patricia, the operations manager Marcus had let go, had stayed in touch with me over the years. She was sharp and she was angry, and she had her own reasons for wanting things to change at Callaway Systems. She connected me with Gerald, who had retired unhappily and who still cared deeply about what happened to the company he'd helped build. Gerald had kept his shares. Patricia had been given a small equity stake years before Marcus took over, something my father had arranged for her as a retention bonus. She had never sold them either, assuming they were worthless under Marcus's direction. I sat across from both of them at a diner outside Dayton and explained what I wanted to do. Gerald looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Your father would have liked this. Between my 37%, Gerald's 12%, and Patricia's 4%, we had 53%, we had 53%, we had 53%, we had a majority. We said nothing. We filed nothing public." We waited. The Meridian Capital deal had been in the works for 6 months. I knew about it because Marcus had sent me a formal shareholder notice, as required by the company's bylaws, informing me of a proposed acquisition vote scheduled for the second Tuesday of November. He framed it as a formality, a good deal for everyone. He had already spoken with the institutional minority shareholders, a couple of small investment groups who had bought in years ago, and secured their support. He expected the vote to pass with ease. The acquisition price was $47 million. Meridian would absorb the company, keep the name for a transition period, and then rebrand. The employees would likely be retained for a year. Marcus and Diane would walk away with enough money to retire comfortably to the house they had already started looking at in Scottsdale. The night before the vote, my brother called me. He was in a good mood, expansive, the way he got when he felt like everything was going his way. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page," he said. "This deal is good for the family, Sarah. You're going to see a nice return on your shares. It's time to let it go." "I'll be there tomorrow," I said. "Great." A pause. "Just don't make things difficult, okay? This has been a long process and everyone is ready to close." I told him I understood. I did. I understood everything. The vote was scheduled for 10 a.m. I arrived at 9:45. Gerald and Patricia were already seated on the far side of the conference table. Marcus had not expected Gerald to be there. I watched his face change slightly when he saw him. Then he looked at Patricia. Then he looked at me. "What is this?" he said. "We're shareholders," Gerald said. "We received proper notice." Marcus looked at his attorney, who had just walked in. They stepped aside and spoke in low voices. I watched Diane watch me from across the room. She had always looked at me like she was calculating something. Today, the calculation looked different. Less certain. The Meridian representatives arrived at 9:58. There were 4 of them, professional and pleasant, the kind of people who had done this many times. They shook hands and opened laptops and arranged themselves with the efficiency of people who expected this to be a short meeting. The meeting was called to order at 10,004. Marcus presented the acquisition terms. He spoke well. He had always spoken well. That had never been the problem. He laid out the offer, the timeline, the benefits. He was confident and clear, and everything in the room felt like a foregone conclusion. Then the vote was called. The 2 institutional investor groups voted yes. Marcus voted his 60% yes. I looked at my brother across the table. He was already gathering his copy of the term sheet. He thought it was done. "Sarah Calloway," the company secretary said. 37% stake. How do you vote?" "No," I said. The room went very quiet. Marcus looked up. "Sarah, Gerald Hutchins," the secretary continued. 12% stake. "No," Gerald said. My brother's face had gone pale. Diane was very still. "Patricia Owens, 4% stake." "No," Patricia said. Patricia said. The secretary paused, adding the numbers. She didn't need to say it out loud. Everyone in the room who could do basic arithmetic already knew. The lead Meridian representative, a man named Clifford who had been entirely relaxed until 30 seconds ago, slowly closed his laptop. "It appears the motion fails," the secretary said. "The vote is 47% in favor, 53% opposed." Marcus stood up so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the credenza behind him. "What did you do?" His voice was low, not loud. That was worse than loud. "I voted my shares," I said. "You don't have—" He stopped. He looked at Gerald, at Patricia. Something was moving behind his eyes, a recalculation, a reconstruction of a timeline he had assumed he understood. "How long have you been planning this?" "Long enough." Diane put her hand on his arm. He shook it off. The Meridian team was packing up with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had seen deals collapse before. Clifford handed his card to Marcus's attorney and said they might revisit the conversation at a later date, under different circumstances, and then they filed out. The room was empty except for the 6 of us. Marcus, Diane, Marcus's attorney, me, Gerald, and Patricia. "This is not over," Marcus said. "I know," I said. "We need to talk about the direction of the company. That's what majority shareholders do. You don't know anything about running this business." Gerald made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He had spent 20 years building the business my brother claimed to own. "I know enough," I said, "and I'm willing to learn the rest." Marcus's attorney put a hand on my brother's shoulder and said something quiet. Marcus stood very still for a long moment, staring at a spot just past me, the way he used to when we were children and I had said something he hadn't expected. Then he picked up his things and left. Diane followed without a word. At the door, she paused and looked back at me, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in 18 years of knowing her. It wasn't anger, it was almost something like respect. She didn't say anything. She left. I sat back down. Patricia set a folder on the table in front of me. Gerald poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the credenza. "So," he said, "what now?" I looked around the conference room. My father's company. His name still on the building. All those years of his work still alive inside the systems and the contracts and the people who had stayed. "Now we fix what got broken," I said. The months that followed were not easy, and I won't pretend they were. Marcus contested the validity of the share arrangement through a second round of legal filings. It took 3 months and cost me more in legal fees than I want to think about. He lost again, more decisively this time. His attorney stopped returning his calls shortly after. The debt came out slowly, the way it always does. Marcus had leveraged his personal shares to secure financing for a real estate investment that had gone sideways in the previous year, a detail none of us had known. When the Meridian deal collapsed, the bank that held his collateral got nervous and called in a portion of the loan. Without the acquisition payout he'd been counting on, Marcus didn't have the liquidity to cover it. He had to sell a significant portion of his stake in Callaway Systems to meet his obligations. I didn't buy those shares. I didn't need to. His ownership dropped to a point where he was a minority voice, and within 6 months he had stepped back from the company entirely. The last time I talked to Marcus was in January, 4 months after the vote. He called me from a number I didn't recognize. His voice was tired. He didn't apologize. I wasn't expecting one. He said he thought I had been unfair and that my father would not have wanted the family to be divided like this. I was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, it was snowing. The first real snow of the year, slow and even across the parking lot below. Dad told me he built something that would matter to both of us, I said. I believed him. I'm trying to make that true. Marcus didn't say anything. You're still a shareholder, I said. You'll still receive distributions. I'm not trying to cut you out, but I am going to run this company, and I'm going to run it the way he built it. A long silence. I need some time, he said finally. I know, I said. Take it. We hung up. I don't know what the future of that conversation is. Some things take longer than others. Gerald came back out of retirement. He works 3 days a week now, consulting, which he says is the right number of days for a man his age, and I think he's probably right. Patricia is back as Director of Operations, a title she earned 20 years ago and should have had then. We brought back 2 of the original engineers Marcus had let go. We renegotiated the logistics contracts my father had built his early reputation on. The company is not the same as it was. My father is not here, and it never will be. But it is recognizable again. It has his shape. I think about him most mornings when I come in. There is a photograph on the wall near the entrance. The building's original ribbon cutting, 1991, my father in a bad suit with a look of pure, terrified joy on his face. I see it every morning when I walk in. I was 4 years old in that photo. I am standing next to him, holding his hand, looking at whatever he was looking at. I used to wonder what we were both looking at. I think we were looking at this, at the building, at what it meant that it existed, at the fact that something he made with his own hands was still standing. I understand that feeling now. I arrived at 9:45 with nothing but a folded document and 6 years of patience, and I walked out of that conference room as the majority voice in my father's company. They thought they knew what I had. They never thought to ask what I'd been building while they weren't looking. My father built something that mattered. I'm making sure it stays that way.